When times got hard, and I mean real hard, our grandmothers didn't panic. They planted. In backyards, front yards, side yards, even along fence lines and alleyways, they dug into the soil and grew hope, one vegetable at a time. This wasn't hobby gardening. This was survival. And every square inch of soil was treated like gold. In those lean years of the Great Depression, when grocery stores held little and wallets held less, Grandma's garden became the lifeline. It wasn't just about feeding the family, it was about doing it with nothing but seeds, sweat, and stubborn determination. Each vegetable chosen wasn't random, it had a purpose. Some gave quick relief when the pantry was empty. Others stored all winter, feeding families when the snow piled high and the world stood still. Every bean, beet, and cabbage leaf carried a lesson in resilience passed down through muddy boots and calloused hands. In this video, we're walking row by row through that garden, from the tomatoes she canned like clockwork, to the root vegetables that outlasted the cold, to the greens that brought color back to the plate in the dark days of winter. You'll discover the stories behind each crop, why it mattered, how it was grown, and the clever ways our grandmothers made the most of every last leaf, stem, and peel. This isn't just food history. It's a tribute to grit, wisdom, and the quiet power of a garden planted in hard times. In Grandma's Depression garden, no crop brought more comfort or more jars to the cellar shelf than the dependable tomato. These ruby-red champions weren't just a summer pleasure, they were a year-round promise. When other vegetables faded with the seasons, tomatoes lived on through the clever hands of grandmothers who knew the power of preservation. Tomatoes offered more than fresh flavor. They offered security. One healthy plant could yield pounds of fruit, and with a little salt, some boiling water, and old mason jars, Grandma could turn a late summer bounty into food for the entire winter. Every August, kitchens turned into steamy canning stations. Grandmothers stood over bubbling pots, filling jar after jar with crushed tomatoes, sauces, salsas, and juice. Each sealed lit a tiny insurance policy against the hunger of cold months ahead. Their versatility made them indispensable. Fresh, they added life to salads and sandwiches. Cooked, they formed the base of stews, soups, gravies, and pasta dishes. When meat was scarce, a simple tomato gravy over biscuits or cornbread became a full meal. Even overripe tomatoes had purpose, turned into relishes, ketchup, or slow-simmered into thick paste. But growing them wasn't always easy. Grandma knew the importance of soil, sun, and spacing. She saved seeds from her healthiest plants, dried them on newspaper, and tucked them in envelopes marked by year. Seed saving wasn't a trend, it was a necessity. She staked and pruned with care, using string, sticks, or whatever was on hand. And when the first frost threatened, she picked the green ones and ripened them on windowsills or turned them into chow-chow relish. One grandmother once said, "We didn't waste a single tomato. Not the peel, not the seed, not even the juice left in the bowl." In hard times, it wasn't just about what you grew. It was about what you could keep. And no vegetable kept hope alive through the dark months quite like the tomato, Grandma's gleaming red badge of survival. In Grandma's Depression garden, green beans served as the perfect bridge between summer abundance and winter scarcity. These prolific plants delivered fresh eating for months while offering enough surplus to preserve and carry families through the cold, hungry season. When times were tough, green beans weren't just a side dish, they were a strategy. Their true value came from their dual nature. Young pods were picked tender and snapped into fresh meals, while the older ones were left to mature and dry right on the vine. Those dried beans became a wintertime protein source when meat was rare. That flexibility allowed grandmothers to harvest based on daily needs while still planning ahead for the months to come. Green beans were incredibly productive. Bush varieties yielded heavily over 6 to 8 weeks, while pole beans climbed up cornstalks, fences, or homemade trellises often built from scrap wood, broom handles, or salvaged string. And the more you picked, the more they grew. Grandmothers knew this secret and walked their rows daily, baskets in hand. When it came to preserving, these beans were champions. Fresh green beans were pressure canned in glass jars, often flavored with garlic or bacon drippings. Others were strung on thread and hung in attics to dry, becoming leather breeches that could be rehydrated in stews. No freezer? No problem. Grandma had a method for every season. In gardens measuring just 50 by 100 feet, green beans shared soil with corn, carrots, onions, tomatoes, cucumbers, and squash. But beans always held their place, prized for being low maintenance, high yield, and easy to save seed from. Grandmothers would hang the best dried pods in brown bags marked for next year, ensuring their garden would keep giving. Green beans were cooked low and slow with onions, salt pork, or bacon grease. A single pot could feed a family when little else was on the table. And by planting new rows every 2 weeks, Grandma ensured that beans were always coming in, a fresh promise during hard times. When Depression-era grandmothers needed a vegetable that could outlast the winter and still bring nourishment to the table, they turned to cabbage, the unsung storage hero of the garden. Dense, hearty, and packed with nutrition, cabbage wasn't just a side dish, it was a survival tool. Grandma didn't choose cabbage just for its fresh crunch. She chose it because it kept. The preferred variety? Danish ballhead, a thick, tightly packed cabbage known for its longevity. These solid heads could sit in root cellars for 6 to 8 months without spoiling, providing one of the few sources of fresh vegetables during the frozen dead of winter. She'd wrap each head in newspaper or pack them carefully in straw-lined boxes. Others she buried in sand or even shallow outdoor trenches, insulated with layers of straw. And when fresh storage wasn't enough, she turned to fermentation, transforming cabbage into sauerkraut, a tangy, vitamin-rich food that boosted immune systems and lasted all winter long. Cabbage was more than practical, it was powerful. Just one serving delivered a hearty dose of vitamin C, acting as a natural defense against illness and malnutrition. When citrus was expensive or impossible to get, cabbage filled the gap, preventing scurvy and keeping families strong. In Grandma's kitchen, cabbage transformed. Raw, it became slaw, crunchy and refreshing. Boiled with potatoes, it turned into hearty suppers. Stuffed with rice and scraps of meat, it made a meal worthy of Sunday dinner. Even the outer leaves weren't wasted, they were chopped for soups or fed to chickens. Clever grandmothers planted 2 crops a year, early cabbages for summer meals and late-season ones for winter storage. And seed saving was no simple task. Cabbage required overwintering and flowering the second year, so the process demanded patience and skill. From side yards to backyard trenches, cabbage earned its place in the Depression garden not for its glamour, but for its grit. It waited quietly in the shadows, offering nourishment when everything else was gone. It wasn't flashy, but it helped families make it through the cold, hungry months with strength. Carrots may look delicate with their feathery tops and bright orange roots, but during the Depression, they were one of the toughest survivors in Grandma's garden. Beneath the surface, these sweet, rugged roots quietly did the work of feeding families, stretching meals, and storing through winter with surprising grace. Grandmothers prized carrots for their ability to grow in cooler weather and less than perfect soil. Unlike fussier crops, carrots could be planted early in the spring and harvested late into fall, offering a reliable food supply for many months. And their sweetness wasn't just a flavor bonus, it made them a favorite among children who weren't used to much sweetness during hard times. Carrots were also champions of long-term storage. Pulled late in the season, they could be packed in sand, buried in boxes, or layered in root cellars where they'd last for months. Smart grandmothers even left some in the ground over winter in milder climates, digging them up as needed. But carrots weren't just stored, they were stretched. Grated into breads and cakes to add moisture and sweetness without using much sugar. Sliced into stews to bulk up a small portion of meat. Boiled and mashed with potatoes or tucked into pies and casseroles when ingredients were scarce. Some grandmothers even made carrot marmalade, using what they had to create a spread that tasted almost like jam. Nothing went to waste. Tops were used in soups or fed to livestock, and the cooking water, rich in nutrients, was often reused in bread dough or broth. During war rationing years, government leaflets even taught housewives how to use carrots as sugar substitutes. And of course, the best roots were saved for seed. Grandmothers left a few carrots to overwinter and flower the following spring, carefully gathering the lacy white seed heads for the next planting season. In the garden, the carrot was quiet and unassuming. But in the kitchen, it was versatile, sweet, and dependable, a little burst of color and comfort when families needed it most. In Grandma's Depression-era kitchen, onions weren't just for flavor, they were survival enhancers. These humble bulbs added depth to even the plainest meals and could elevate a pot of beans or boiled potatoes into something that felt hearty and home-cooked. In hard times, onions became one of the most trusted flavor preservers in the garden. What made onions so valuable was their versatility and durability. They could be chopped, caramelized, roasted, pickled, or dried. A single onion could stretch flavor across multiple meals. When meat was absent, which was often, onions stepped in with their rich aroma and sweet savory taste, creating the illusion of fullness and richness where there was little. Grandmothers planted onions in spring and again in late summer, ensuring a nearly year-round supply. They favored hardy yellow storage onions, like the old-fashioned Ebenezer or Stuttgarter varieties, that cured well and lasted deep into winter. After harvest, onions were laid out to dry in barns, porches, or sunny windowsills, their papery skins sealing them up for the cold months ahead. Storage was simple but effective. Onions were tied in braids or nets and hung from cellar rafters where air could circulate. A pantry lined with onion braids was a quiet symbol of security, a sign that flavor and nutrition would still find a way to the table even in the leanest months. Grandma used onions to flavor soups, gravies, greens, and even breads. Fried in bacon grease, they topped cornbread or cabbage. Simmered slowly, they became the heart of a soup when meat wasn't an option. Pickled onions were stored in vinegar with peppercorns and sugar, becoming a tangy side dish that added brightness to bland meals. Even onion skins weren't wasted, they were used to color fabric or Easter eggs naturally. And when illness struck, some grandmothers swore by placing sliced onions around the house to pull sickness from the air, a folk remedy passed down through generations. In the garden and the cellar, onions were more than a seasoning. They were the quiet foundation of taste, tradition, and resilience. During the Great Depression, when store-bought sugar was expensive and often rationed, beets stepped forward as nature's answer to sweetness. In Grandma's garden, these deep red roots weren't just a colorful addition, they were a quiet powerhouse of nutrition, flavor, and homemade ingenuity. Beets thrived in poor soil and cooler temperatures, making them perfect for Depression-era gardens. Grandmothers loved them because they were dependable and forgiving. Planted in early spring or late summer, beets matured quickly and stored well through winter, making them a reliable food source when other vegetables failed. But what truly made beets special was their natural sugar content. Though not sweet like candy, they offered enough sweetness to transform humble dishes. Grandma would roast them for warmth and flavor, pickle them with vinegar and cloves for long-term storage, or shred them into cakes and breads to add moisture and richness without wasting precious sugar. Nothing went unused. Beet greens, often overlooked today, were cooked like spinach or added to soups and stews. Rich in iron and vitamins, they gave families a vital nutrient boost when resources were scarce. Even the cooking water was sometimes saved and used as a natural dye for fabric or eggs. Preserving beets was an art. Many grandmothers pickled them in big batches, slicing the roots thin and sealing them in vinegar-filled mason jars. These jars lined pantry shelves in neat rows, their ruby contents glowing like little promises of flavor in the long winter months. Beets were also essential for seed saving. Grandmothers selected their healthiest roots, stored them through winter, then replanted them the next spring to flower and produce seed. It was a 2-year commitment, one made not just for food, but for the survival of a way of life. One woman once recalled, "We didn't have candy, but we had pickled beets." That was our treat. In a world without desserts or store-bought sweets, beets brought a hint of joy and a whole lot of color to the dinner table. In a Depression-era garden where every inch of soil mattered, few vegetables offered more value per square foot than Swiss chard. Known by many grandmothers as perpetual spinach, this leafy green was treasured not just for its taste, but for its generosity. It kept growing back long after it was cut. In hard times, that made it nothing short of a miracle. Swiss chard was the ideal cut-and-come-again crop. Grandmothers would snip off the outer leaves as needed, and within days, new ones would appear. One planting could feed a family all season long. It thrived in both heat and cold, resisted pests, and grew in soil that other greens might reject. For struggling families with limited space and resources, chard meant dependable, low-maintenance nutrition. It wasn't just easy to grow, it was packed with nourishment. High in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C, Swiss chard helped prevent the nutritional deficiencies that plagued so many families during the Depression. It could be cooked like spinach, added to soups and stews, or sautéed in bacon grease with onions and vinegar for a hearty side dish. Even the colorful stems were used, chopped into casseroles, pickled, or stewed down like celery. Grandmothers knew to plant it early in spring and again in late summer. When frost threatened, they covered it with blankets or straw to stretch the growing season even longer. Some even grew it indoors in boxes during the harshest winters, placing it near sunlit windows. Swiss chard's resilience made it a favorite in victory gardens and backyard plots alike. It didn't bolt in summer heat like lettuce, and it didn't need replanting like mustard or kale. And it was beautiful too. Its vibrant red, white, and yellow stems brightened drab gardens and lifted tired spirits. When other crops failed or bolted, chard just kept on giving. In the quiet calculations of a Depression grandmother, that made it priceless. It wasn't flashy, but it was faithful, growing, regrowing, and feeding families through the hardest of times. When Grandma needed something fast, something that could grow quickly, fill bellies, and stretch the family's food supply, she turned to turnips. Often overlooked today, these humble root vegetables were once the unsung miracle of the Depression-era garden. Quick to mature, easy to grow, and nourishing from root to leaf, turnips earned their place as a go-to emergency crop. Turnips were the garden's early responders. In just 30 to 60 days from planting, they could produce a harvest. That meant when other vegetables were still weeks away, turnips were already on the table. Grandmothers planted them in both spring and late summer, making them one of the few vegetables that could feed the family in both warm and cold seasons. Their usefulness extended far beyond the root. The leafy green tops were packed with calcium, iron, and vitamins, and were often the first fresh greens to appear after a long winter. Sautéed with bacon grease or stewed with onions, they brought both nutrition and comfort to hungry tables. The roots themselves were versatile: boiled, mashed with potatoes, roasted in casseroles, or added to stews. Their mild, slightly peppery flavor paired well with whatever scraps were available. Some grandmothers even sliced them thin and fried them like potatoes. When food was scarce, turnips filled the gap quickly and efficiently. Turnips stored well, too. After the fall harvest, they were packed in sawdust or straw-lined boxes and kept in cool cellars. Some grandmothers left them right in the ground under a thick layer of mulch, digging them up as needed during winter. And when it came to saving seed, the process was simple. A few healthy roots were replanted in early spring and allowed to flower, producing pods full of next year's supply. Turnips weren't glamorous, but in the hands of a Depression-era grandmother, they were a miracle crop: fast, forgiving, and always ready to help when other foods ran low. In the rhythm of the survival garden, turnips were the first to arrive and among the last to be forgotten. When the snows finally melted and the soil could be worked with bare hands, peas were the first true taste of spring in Grandma's Depression-era garden. They symbolized more than just food, they were hope in green pods, bursting with sweetness and relief after a long, barren winter. Peas thrived in cool weather, making them one of the earliest crops to plant and harvest. Grandmothers knew exactly when to sow them, often by the calendar or by old sayings like "plant peas when the daffodils bloom." Within weeks, delicate vines began climbing makeshift trellises made from sticks, string, or even old bed springs. There were two kinds of peas in the garden: shelling peas, prized for the sweet green pearls inside, and snap peas, where both pod and seed were eaten. In early spring, when few other vegetables were available, fresh peas brought much-needed vitamins and cheer to the dinner table. Fresh from the vine, peas were a treat. But smart grandmothers didn't stop there, they preserved the bounty. Shelling peas were blanched and canned, stored in gleaming glass jars that lined pantry shelves. Others were dried for winter soups and stews, where they added body and nutrition when meat was scarce. Pea vines also improved the soil, fixing nitrogen and preparing the garden for summer crops. After harvest, the spent plants were tilled back into the earth or fed to livestock. Even the smallest garden plots included a row of peas, they were just that essential. Kids were often the pea pickers, sent out with baskets to gather pods in the early morning when they were sweetest. A bowl of buttered peas was a Sunday favorite, and leftovers were turned into patties or added to cold salads with onions and vinegar. Seed saving was simple. Grandmothers let a few pods dry completely on the vine, cracking them open to reveal hard, rattling seeds, next year's hope already waiting. In the cycle of survival, peas marked the start of a new chapter. They whispered of warmer days ahead and offered families a soft, green promise that even after the hardest winter, life would return. In the sweltering heat of Depression-era summers, when tempers and pantries both ran thin, cucumbers offered a rare gift: coolness, crunch, and abundance. They weren't just a refreshing treat in Grandma's garden, they were a symbol of simple luxury, growing fast and giving generously. Cucumbers thrived in the warmth, and grandmothers loved them for their eagerness to produce. Once they started growing, they didn't stop. A few well-tended vines could supply dozens of fruits over the season. Climbing fences, trellises, or even crawling freely across the soil, they made themselves at home wherever space allowed. Sliced raw with vinegar, salt, and pepper, cucumbers brought bright flavor to meals that were otherwise heavy or plain. On especially hot days, chilled cucumber slices in a tin bowl were a cooling reward after long hours of work. And when there were more cucumbers than a family could eat fresh, and there usually were, Grandma turned them into pickles. Pickling cucumbers became a summer ritual. Grandmothers filled mason jars with brine, garlic, dill, and spices, preserving the harvest for long months ahead. These pickles added crunch and tang to winter meals, and just a few slices could liven up a plate of beans or bread. Sweet pickles, dill spears, relish, each jar reflected her creativity and thrift. Some grandmothers even pickled cucumber peels or made cucumber water to stay cool. In hard times, nothing was wasted. Vines and blossoms were fed to chickens or composted to enrich next year's soil. Growing cucumbers took planning. Seeds were started once the soil warmed, and Grandma carefully spaced the vines to avoid rot and disease. She often planted them alongside corn or beans, making the most of limited space. And the best fruits were left to mature, yellow and fat, for seed saving, tucked away in paper envelopes marked with the year. Cucumbers didn't feed the family like potatoes or beans. But in a summer of sweat and worry, they offered something just as vital: relief, refreshment, and a little crisp joy at the end of a long day. In the earliest days of spring, when the ground was still waking up from winter's grip, lettuce offered the first tender bite of freshness. For Depression-era grandmothers, this simple leafy green wasn't just about flavor, it was about comfort. A handful of fresh-picked lettuce brought a kind of renewal that only those who had endured long winters could understand. Lettuce grew fast and needed little to thrive. Grandmothers sowed it as soon as the soil could be worked, sometimes planting it in cold frames or under old window panes to coax an even earlier harvest. Within weeks, soft green leaves would unfurl, ready to be picked by the handful. There were many varieties: butterhead, romaine, crisphead, and loose leaf. Each had its place in the garden and in the kitchen. Loose leaf was harvested leaf by leaf, providing a continual supply. Romaine was sturdy and crunchy, perfect for sandwiches or hearty salads. Butterhead offered a silky texture that melted on the tongue. But what truly made lettuce precious was timing. It arrived when pantries were still thin, when preserved foods had grown monotonous, and when families desperately needed something green, fresh, and alive. A simple plate of lettuce with vinegar, salt, and a dash of sugar could transform a meal and lift a weary spirit. Grandma paired lettuce with green onions or radishes for early spring salads, often served with cornbread or beans. And if there was a little bacon grease or boiled egg to add, it became a feast. Lettuce also wrapped scraps of meat or vegetables when bread was scarce, becoming edible bundles of nourishment. Because lettuce didn't store well, it was a lesson in timing. Plant too much, and it would bolt in the heat; too little, and the garden missed its window of green. Grandmothers staggered their plantings every few weeks to keep the harvest coming. Though it was delicate and short-lived, lettuce reminded families that fresh things were possible again, that after cold and hardship, the earth still gave generously. In the lean days of the Great Depression, when strength was needed and nutrients were scarce, spinach came to the rescue as one of the garden's quiet superfoods. Grandmothers knew this dark leafy green wasn't just another vegetable, it was a medicinal crop, a healing food, and a fast-growing gift for families who couldn't afford to be tired or sick. Spinach had a reputation for strength, long before cartoons made it famous. Rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C, it helped fight fatigue, build immunity, and ward off deficiencies that were all too common in homes where meat and dairy were luxuries. Grandmothers planted it early, knowing it thrived in cool weather and delivered a quick harvest, sometimes in as little as 30 days. It was one of the first greens to appear after winter. Rows of deep green leaves would rise just as the frost faded, bringing color and nourishment to tables that had relied too long on root vegetables and canned goods. In that fresh green pile was everything the family had been missing: strength, flavor, and hope. Spinach was incredibly versatile. It could be boiled, creamed, sautéed in bacon fat, mixed into eggs, folded into casseroles, or eaten raw in simple salads. And when there was an abundance, Grandma dried the extra leaves for use in winter soups, crumbling them into broths or flour to boost meals with hidden nutrients. Its quick-growing nature made it a favorite for successive planting. As one row was harvested, another would already be sprouting. Grandmothers tucked it in every corner of the garden, between corn stalks, under taller plants, even in window boxes. Seed saving was simple. A few spinach plants were allowed to bolt and go to seed. These were gathered and stored in brown paper envelopes, ensuring another round of this precious green the next year. Spinach wasn't flashy, but it was fierce. In times when strength was needed to keep going, to tend gardens, raise children, and stretch every meal, spinach was the green that helped families push through, one iron-rich bite at a time. In the Great Depression garden, peppers added more than just a pop of color, they brought power. Bright, bold, and bursting with nutrients, peppers were Grandma's secret weapon against sickness and bland meals. These crisp vegetables weren't just garden variety, they were vitamin-rich lifelines. What most people didn't realize back then, but Grandma instinctively knew, was that peppers were packed with vitamin C. In fact, they held more of it than most citrus fruits, which were often expensive or completely unavailable during the Depression. A few slices of raw pepper could help protect the family from colds, scurvy, and fatigue without a single orange in sight. Peppers loved the heat, so grandmothers waited until the soil was good and warm before planting. But once they started producing, they didn't stop. Green bell peppers, banana peppers, hot varieties like cayenne or jalapeno all found a place in the backyard rows. They were easy to grow, pest-resistant, and stunning to look at. Their vibrant reds, yellows, and greens brightened up the garden and the plate. In the kitchen, peppers did double duty. Raw, they were sliced thin and tossed into salads or packed into vinegar jars for pickling. Cooked, they were stuffed with rice and meat scraps for hearty meals, sautéed with onions to flavor beans, or chopped into eggs for breakfast hash. Even the hotter peppers weren't wasted, they were dried, ground, and stored in jars to spice up meals throughout the year. Nothing was wasted. Seeds from the best peppers were dried and saved in little paper packets marked by hand. Grandma knew which plants had thrived through heat and drought, and she carefully chose her seed stock for next year's planting. When flavor was scarce and nutrition mattered most, peppers delivered both. They added life to the plate, color to the garden, and strength to the family. In a time when every bite had to count, peppers reminded struggling households that good health could still grow in the backyard even in the hardest of times. These weren't just vegetables, they were lifelines, quietly growing in backyard soil while families weathered the hardest times. If you found comfort in these forgotten garden champions, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More timeless kitchen wisdom is just around the corner.